I want to tell you, first of all, and some of you may already know, but when you hear the word clinic, a lot of people assume why do you have a medical facility in a law school? And clinic usually is associated with medicine. In a law school environment, though, clinic is associated with real life work that students can be involved in while they're getting their classroom education. And so we opened the clinic in 2003 and came largely out of my frustration of being a criminal defense attorney working in a system where there was a lot of pain and a lot of trauma and a lot of brokenness, and a system that is not designed to address that. So students now sign up because they're interested in restorative justice, they're interested in criminal justice, they're interested in juvenile justice, they're interested in working with young people and adults because we do things across the board. And I have them for 3 hours a week in the classroom environment where I teach them about all those things. And the classroom, my classroom, is a very experiential class. I do not lecture in my class. You probably, if you've read anything about restorative justice, you probably have heard the term circle process or peace circles. I know in one of the pieces that Becky sent out, the radio show especially, I think they were mentioning peace circles. And I teach in that format. My students sit in a circle. We use what's called a talking piece, which is an object that has significance to the person that brings it. We tell a story about what the significance is. I'll give the students a prompt, and then I'll pass that talking piece to my right or to my left. And when the talking piece comes to you, it's an opportunity for you to answer the prompt. Or if you're not quite ready, it's an opportunity for you to pass the talking piece. It does go in order around the room. You cannot call for the talking piece. You must wait and listen and process, knowing that you will get a turn. It's a very empowering and very equalizing way to have discussions. We can talk about issues. We can talk about subject matter. I'll give my students a case to read on the first day, and they'll read that. And then when we come back in on the second day, we'll process that. It's a murder case where a restorative practice was done, a circle was done. And I will begin by telling them one thing we need to be thinking about in law school, which, believe it or not, we don't think a lot about in law school, is justice. And the question that I ask is, in this case, what does justice require? And the first place that we start is for me to ask them, who do you see, after reading the case, who do you see that was affected by this crime? Who's been affected by this murder? And we pass the talking piece. And so each student can name one person each time the talking piece comes to them. And by the time we get around the room a couple of times, we fill that whiteboard up with people that have been affected by that crime. And it really begins to open their eyes about what justice is and what justice does require. It opens their eyes as to the ripple effect of crime. It is not just an offense against the state where a law has been broken. It is an offense against people. It affects them. It affects relationships. It affects the community that they live in. It affects families. It just has such a huge ripple effect. And our traditional system is just simply not designed to address those things. Our system is designed to address the offense, and it asks three basic questions. What law was broken? Who did it? And once we decide who did it, what punishment do they deserve? And so that is a very offense and offender focused system. That leaves out an awful lot. And so restorative justice recognizes that harm takes place, and it asks three very different questions. Who's been affected by this? How have they been affected by this? What do they need to address the way that they've been affected by this? And so what we do in our program is we work to bring those parties together. We don't start there. We begin with them as individuals to help them understand who we are and what our process has to offer and how their needs might be met well in our process. And they may have some needs that can be met in our traditional system too. I will tell you that it depends, and in my mind, it depends on the severity and the level of crime and trauma that has happened as to whether restorative justice is the only thing that's appropriate, or if a little bit of both may be appropriate. In the more traumatic and more serious crimes, what I see almost always is that if there's a restorative process, there is also a traditional process that happens as well. And I'll give you some examples of some cases that we've been involved in as we talk tonight. I mentioned a while ago that I was very frustrated as a criminal defense attorney going to a courtroom every day and seeing so much pain that I didn't think was addressed, saying it's got to be a better way. And so out of that frustration, I was led to restorative justice and began to learn about it and began to think, I think this is the answer to my frustration. I will say that probably the safest place to do new programming and to make change is not with high-level crimes, but probably is with children. And we have a lot of children that get drafted into our traditional legal systems in North Carolina and in other states. In North Carolina, up until this past year, if you were 16 years old and were charged with a crime, you were not placed in the juvenile system. You were immediately placed in our adult criminal system. And to me, that was just ridiculous. I mean, I've raised 3 children that were 16 years old at one time, right? And they are not adults, and they were not able to understand or navigate that system. And so fortunately, we did pass a law that has raised the age so that 16 and 17-year-olds at least begin now in our juvenile system. They're not guaranteed to stay in it. They can still wind up in our adult system, but at least they begin there. And another thing that exacerbated the problem and frustrated me was I was representing a lot of kids in juvenile court and even in adult court, if they were 16 or 17 at the time, that had committed some sort of offense in school. And this was during a time of zero tolerance. After Columbine, we started putting law enforcement officers in our schools. Things that otherwise were seen as juvenile delinquent behavior turned into criminal behavior. A lot of kids began being arrested and sent into our courts. And my experience was that I was representing people in juvenile court that once they were adjudicated as having been guilty, they had a very difficult time navigating what was placed on them, the responsibilities that were placed on them, and had a hard time navigating out of that juvenile system. And then that's complicated at the time. As soon as they turn 16, if they commit another crime, they're no longer in the juvenile system, but they're in the adult system. So, you know, we all know what a detriment it is to have a criminal record, to be involved in the legal system. It highly decreases the chances that you're going to graduate from high school, that you're going to be employable, that you're going to have the productive kind of life that you might otherwise be able to have. So I was looking for a way that we could help schools divert kids away from the criminal system. And it took the form of a restorative justice clinic where we initially took cases straight from the juvenile court as what we call a diversion program. So the kids would be petitioned into the court could take a look at the cases, and before they sent a kid into the court with a lawyer to face a judge and a prosecutor, they could divert them out to our program. And so we started doing a lot of that work. We had success early on. It made a lot of sense to a lot of people. Victims were satisfied. Most of those cases where everybody's happy and the state understands that everybody's happy, they don't have any interest in continuing to prosecute. So that was a way to keep these young people out of the criminal system that they had a hard time navigating, and always also was a way to help victims of those crimes to be satisfied with the outcomes when they had the meeting and damages and harm was understood and then was addressed in positive ways by the young people that had committed the harm. A byproduct of this is that recidivism rates tend to be very low for people that go through a restorative process who have offended. And it's a transformative kind of process. And so they gain an awful lot of understanding about what they did, about who they did it to, about how it's affected so many people in their lives and how it's affected them and other people. And they tend not to reoffend once they go through a process. We know that recidivism rates in our traditional authoritarian and punitive systems is not very good. And those punitive systems exist not just in courts, but they exist in schools and they exist in most systems that we have in America. I'm happy to report, though, that restorative justice is growing pretty dramatically. The most dramatic growth that we see is in schools, and I think that's really good. And I was glad that our program grew in schools. We became a program that was a first choice for schools, and courts were not a first choice for schools. And that made me happy because that really fulfilled what I wanted to do, which was create a way to keep kids from ever touching the criminal legal system to begin with. And so when schools began to buy into it, that was accomplished. At the time, and I'm going to stop in a little while, let y'all ask some questions and make some comments. Don't think I'm going to talk for the whole 45 minutes or so. At the time, I've lost my train of thought about where I was getting ready to go with that. But at the time, our clinic was located in Buies Creek, which is where Campbell University is still located. Any connections to Buies Creek, you can raise your hand if you have a Buies Creek connection. Awesome. So I want to hear about those connections when you get a chance, when I stop talking. We are learning that all roads actually lead to Buies Creek. It's just a great place. The law school began to fall down around our ears. In about 2007, we began to realize we were going to have to leave the building. We couldn't reoccupy it. The university started looking at other places that we could relocate. It's a long story, but the short of it is there was a beautiful building in downtown Raleigh that was offered to the university. And we wound up moving the law school from Buies Creek to downtown Raleigh in 2009. Celebrated our 10th anniversary last year. So that meant that my clinical program moved. So we left Harnett, Johnson, and Lee counties. We left the schools, we left the courts, and we started serving Wake County. And Wake County has one of the largest school systems in the country. It is the seat of government in North Carolina. We started serving courts and schools, and our referrals are mostly come from the Wake County school system. They by far outnumber the referrals that we get from the courts, and I think that's a good thing. What that means is there are a lot of kids that otherwise could be sent into a criminal legal system that are not. They're sent away from that into something that can be very positive for them. It means that school suspensions go down. It means that conflict goes down. It means that school attendance goes up. That translates, as you would imagine, into higher grades, better school climate. And it's not just the conflict resolution work that we do that's so effective. I mentioned the circle process a while ago. We're doing an awful lot of training in the school system to train staff, teachers, administrators, how to do circles on their own in the schools, bring kids into those circles, to build relationship, create a positive climate. And we are beginning to see the results of that. And I always thought that as good as the facilitated dialogue conflict resolution tool was, I always thought that circles would be even more effective than that. And we're beginning to see that schools that are implementing circles are seeing pretty dramatic drops in their conflict cases, especially in middle school and high school. Elementary schools have some conflict. They have some fights, not nearly at the level that middle school and high schools do. So we do most of our what we call facilitated dialogue work in middle schools and high schools. We do circles there, but we also began implementing circles in elementary schools about 4 years ago. And so it's a very effective program. I want to just run through some of the places that we're using this, just so you get a feel for the breadth and the depth of what we do in our clinic. And then I'm going to stop talking and let y'all voice your concerns or comments or ask me questions. So we do the work in the schools. We do the work in the juvenile courts. We have gotten a few felony cases from the adult courts. those are cases where there are examples that we would have a restorative process, but a defendant would understand going into that process that there was going to be a day in court for them. They can mitigate the punishment by going through a restorative process and being sincere in it and having good outcomes and meeting the needs of the victim, but they can't completely get rid of that. An example would be, instead of going to prison, we had a young man in Durham that discharged a weapon that went through the floor of his apartment and went through the abdomen of a 10-year-old girl. He turned himself in once he found out what he had done. He was a good candidate for restorative justice. He pled guilty to the charges, but instead of going to prison, he had a probationary sentence, and then he was ordered to complete the probation. And a lot of that came out of what the victims told him that they needed him to do, and he was able to do that, and he was able to be successful. So we're beginning to see more of those cases. We do circles in prisons because one thing that we recognize is that recidivism rates are extremely high for people that go to prison. And I had always thought that even though they certainly need a lot of support in a lot of practical areas when they come out of prison, they need education, they need transportation, they need jobs, they need community support. But one thing that I think they need is an understanding of the harm they've done so that they can have some transformation of their emotion and spiritual life, and so that they can build some empathy around what they've done, and they're going to have more motivation not to continue in that kind of lifestyle. And we're seeing a lot of the folks that we work with that are coming out, and they're being very successful. I'm just looking at a few notes that I wrote down. I'm going to go through this quickly, and then I'm going to stop. This work can be done in murder cases after the court day is over and people have been sentenced. We have had people that have had loved ones that were murdered that feel like they've gone as far as they can go in their healing process, and they would come to us and say, can you help me have a dialogue? And so we will be involved in that work. We take victims and survivors with us into our prison circles to tell their story, and that's one way that we help to build a lot of empathy within people that have committed similar crimes. We last year developed a relationship with a juvenile prison in Rocky Mount. It's called the Edgecombe Youth Development Center. And we taught their staff how to mediate conflict the way that we do it in schools and other places. We've taught them how to run circles, and so they have implemented those. I'm actually going to Edgecombe YDC on Wednesday, and I'll be there all day helping them to mediate conflict in 4 cases that they had. We have trained community folks. Most of this is faith-based, and you may be interested in how to do circle in the community or how to do it in your church. There's a church that is now called Common Thread. Before it was called North Raleigh Community Church. Doug Hammock is the pastor. And after the last presidential election, he learned that he didn't have all like-minded people, and he began to have Facebook wars. And he reached out to me and asked if I could train his folks in how to do circles so that they could address some of these things in a peaceful and loving way. And so I spent about 13 weeks that summer after the election working in his church and helping folks, and I think they've been very effective in what they've done. I recently had attorneys that reached out to me who represented a young woman who was severely injured in a car crash. She has a serious permanent brain injury, and the money settlement is not an issue because they've already got that figured out. The defendant is his insurance company is just going to tender the policy limits, but the young lady wanted a meeting with the young man because she wanted to have some conversation. She wanted to know what he was doing. Why did this happen? She wants him to be able to see and know the severity of the injury, and they have all agreed to do that. So I'll be getting involved in that in a couple of weeks along with my law students, and I'm looking forward to doing that. We do a lot of training for school systems across the state. I'll be going to Mount Gilead tomorrow in Montgomery County to do about a 3.5-hour circle with the staff of an elementary school. I'll be with about half of them tomorrow, and then we'll go back in about 2 weeks and we'll be with the other half of the staff. We were down there last year and did a 2-day circle keeper training with them so that they could begin doing circles. And this is a school where the principal was involved in that, but she wants her staff to now be involved in that. And so that's a pretty common thing that we're involved in.
So I see the questions from Lori. She said, are consequences decided in conjunction with the victims or for the victims?
That's such a great question. This is a victim-centered approach. And so nothing is decided for the victim. Actually, nothing is decided for the offender unless the victim asks for it and the offender agrees to do it. So we are working hand in hand with victims and offenders. And if they desire to have a face-to-face meeting, and if everybody thinks it can be done in a safe and productive way, we facilitate that face-to-face meeting. And the point is to understand the harm and then understand what the offenders can do to try to rectify that harm in as good a way as possible. So great question. Everything is done with, not for.
John, just for those who came in a little late, can you kind of describe the punitive system, what the punitive system entails and what the restorative justice system entails?
Yeah, I had given 3 basic questions on both sides. The punitive system basically asked what law has been broken, who did it, what do they deserve. Those deserts come in the form of some sort of punishment and usually some sort of supervision, whether it's probationary supervision or all the way up to being in prison. And so when you only ask those 3 questions, you're leaving out the needs that victims have and you're leaving them out of the process. And so restorative justice tries to come alongside and ask 3 very different questions. Who's been hurt? How have they been hurt? What needs to be done to address that harm? And offenders are the ones who have an obligation to address the harm. And so restorative practices are involved in trying to answer those questions.
Another question, what are circles and what does that training entail?
Okay. Circles is a way to bring larger groups of people together. For example, if we were in circle tonight, if we could sit together in circle, we would be sitting in a circle. We would not have any obstructions between us. We'd all just be sitting in chairs without desks. We would probably have what's called a centerpiece, which is something in the center of things that have significance. We would build a centerpiece together. One of the first things I would do would be to ask you to tell us what values you need others to bring to the circle tonight to make this a safe place for you to be able to tell your stories and speak your truth. I always take paper plates and markers and I ask you to write those down. We use our talking piece, which is an object that we pass around the circle. And when the object comes to you, it's your opportunity to speak and it's everybody else's opportunity to listen. And so we would talk about our values in that way. And it goes in order around the circle. So you can't call for it. You have to wait for it. And that means that you're listening to others. Circles can be used for lots of different reasons. One of the simplest things to use it for is to celebrate. The lady that works with me is Joya Karen, and she tells a story of doing a birthday circle for all of her children. She has 4 children. And she tells about the different objects that she brought, and she uses Luke as her example. And she brought his baby shoes on his 18th birthday. She brought his soccer cleats from when he was about 5 years old. I'm actually taking his little soccer ball with me to Montgomery County tomorrow to use as a talking piece because we can't physically pass things tomorrow because we need to be sanitary. And so we're going to roll the ball with our feet to each other. She talks about a prompt that she used at the end and this was with her kids. What do you hope for Luke? And her oldest son, and this was a broken family where the father had left when the children were fairly young, but she's got 2 boys that are a little bit older. And the oldest son said, "My hope is that you'll just be successful, Luke, and be happy and get what you want." And he began to cry. He said, because since Dad left, I have always felt responsible for you. And she said, without the circle, she doesn't think she would have ever heard that from her older son. She had never heard that before. But he was in a safe place and had an opportunity to say that. And so that's just one example. When we do circles in prisons, the inmates have an opportunity to tell their stories. We take victims with us to tell their stories because we're trying to build empathy. When we're in a school setting, we're usually just building community. And so teachers and staff will lead circles with their students just to try to get to know each other and build community, which leads to lesser conflict in the school day.
Two kind of questions that go together. How can we as individuals or our faith community get involved? And, you know, where is it? And what does that training entail?
We can do, we do a lot of training, as you've already heard me say. Awareness, we do a basic 3-hour awareness training so you can experience circle. And you can make an informed decision then as to whether you want to go deeper. Going deeper usually is our 2-day basic circle keeper training. I mentioned a while ago that we did that in Montgomery County last year, and I'm going to go back to Montgomery tomorrow to do a 3-hour awareness with a staff at an elementary school. And we come in and we provide that training. When we do it for Wake County Schools, there's no fee because we are in partnership with them, and Wake County Schools has developed a team and we all work together to do this work. When I get asked, like when I go to Montgomery County tomorrow, there's a fee that they pay into the clinic, and when I do private training like that, there's a fee that we charge for that. But that basically is the level. You can have an awareness piece, or you could have a full 2-day basic circle keeper training to learn how to be a circle keeper.
How do you get the schools to buy in?
You know, it's been easy. I say that. I shouldn't say that. It's easy now. It wasn't easy 17, 18 years ago. I used to say I was begging people to listen to me. And if they ever finally said, okay, come tell us about it, they looked at me when I was done like I had a horn growing out of my head. They were not lined up at the door saying, please give me your business card because we want to know more. So it was a struggle, but once we began to have success, you know, people talk, especially in the school system. And I did a presentation for 5 schools that had come together with some teams to learn how to do positive behavior support. And I had a friend that was the positive behavior support coordinator, and he was doing the training, and he asked me to come in and do a section on restorative justice, and I did. One of those social workers went back to his high school and he told the principal, he said, if we're going to be a PBS school, we need to be a restorative practice school. And that's how we began in schools. And before you knew it, now in Harnett County, there are only 4 high schools, but before you knew it, we got invited to go to one of the other high schools, and then we were in all 4, and then we were in the middle schools, and it grew that way. And then we came to Wake. Our reputation had preceded us, and so we were immediately invited to come into several Wake County schools. And it's just a very positive way to address school discipline issues and to help keep kids in school and to create a safer and a better learning environment. So we don't work quite so hard anymore as we used to.
Who makes the referrals in schools?
It's up to the schools, and it happens in a couple of different ways. A pretty common way is that assistant principals will be assigned to handle the disciplinary issues. And so we get a lot of referrals from assistant principals. And this comes because we do create relationship with them. They will hear about it. They will invite us to come in. We'll meet with the leadership team. Usually from there, we'll do a whole staff awareness piece. Becky had provided you a link to what I think is a good video of a case that we did at Broughton High School. And so I would just encourage you, if you haven't already seen that, take a look at that. I would have shown it to you tonight, but I knew you already had an opportunity to look at it. If you haven't looked at it, please look at it. It's just a great example of the mediation work that we do in schools. So APs can send them. Counselors deal with a lot of disciplinary issues. Counselors can send them. Some principals will send them. We have schools where school resource officers send them, which I love because that's the kind of resource officer that I want in a school. So in schools, they come from those kinds of folks.
So there was a question is, what is your relationship with SROs in schools? And perhaps what are your thoughts about SROs in schools?
My thoughts are evolving. When I first got started in this work, I wanted to abolish all SROs in all schools. That's when I was working full-time as a criminal defense attorney and part-time as a restorative justice practitioner. The reason that I was frustrated was because they were not trained to be relational. They were trained to be law enforcement officers, and they were doing what they were trained to do. And I was seeing a lot of things that were criminalized that shouldn't, in my opinion, shouldn't have been criminalized. I think SROs have come a long way now, though, and training has gotten better. The memorandum of understanding between law enforcement agencies and Wake County schools has gotten a lot better. Most of the SROs that I come in contact with are very relational. They believe in community policing. They don't believe in arresting. Now, I must say, I am in contact with SROs that are working in schools that want to be restorative. So I'm not saying everybody out there is like that. So my thinking has evolved. I still, and I have proposed this to the school system, I still would like to see them pilot a program where they would take 3 schools. And I don't know that we have SROs in elementary schools, but if they would take 2 or 3 schools where there are currently SROs, take them out, increase programs like restorative justice programs, and monitor those schools for 3 or 4 years, and let's look at the data, and let's compare data between those schools with other schools that are still using SROs and are more punitive. I just, my theory is that we would see better data from schools that took SROs out than we would that haven't. I'm not condemning SROs. I think there are a lot of good ones out there. And so that's a long answer, but my thinking has evolved somewhat on that.
So we've talked quite a bit about schools, the work in the schools, but as far as in the justice system itself, how close or far along are we to having a more restorative justice system rather than a punitive system?
We're not nearly as close as I had hoped that we would be by now. I gotta tell you, if our law school were still located in Judicial District 11, which is Harnett, Johnson, and Lee, I think that jurisdiction would be farther along now than other jurisdictions are, but I'm not there anymore. We were seeing a lot of progress. We got a lot of referrals from the juvenile system, and not too long before we actually left, I had a request to go to the adult system, to expand into the adult system. And the chief judge, after some consternation around that, and after asking me to meet with the prosecutors and the defense attorneys about that, and they were favorable, agreed that we could move into the adult system. So I wrote the local rules to be able to do that. He signed off on them, and then the law school moved to Raleigh. Wake County, I have found to be in the court system a more punitive jurisdiction. Now, I must say I have good relationship with the current district attorney, Lauren Freeman. She comes to my class and speaks. She listens about restorative justice. We have gotten 1 case from the Wake County adult system, but we are not nearly as far along as I would hope that we would be. Let me say this though. We are developing a relationship with the Department of Corrections. And I am really impressed with Tim Moose is the Deputy Director of the Department of Corrections. He's been in the Department of Public Safety for a long time, but he's fairly new in the Department of Corrections. And he is a very forward-thinking guy. And so I've met with him, and everything that I said that I would like to do, he has said, yes, I think we should do that. So I'm very hopeful within the North Carolina Department of Corrections. I'm less hopeful in our court system. And there's something to understand too. Jurisdictions are run by different folks. I mean, we got a bunch of jurisdictions within the state of North Carolina. I mentioned Judicial District 11. That's Harnett, Johnson, Lee, where I used to be. Wake County is 10. You know, everywhere you go, you've got some districts that are made up of 2 or 3 counties, maybe 5. Wake County is 1. So it varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
So is it really dependent on the district attorney or the judges in that district to buy in?
It is largely dependent on the district attorney. Judges are deemed to be impartial actors within the court. And so it's even hard for them to express an opinion about it. I will say, though, that Chief Judge Rader in Wake County has been extremely supportive of the work that we do. He signed off immediately on the rules that allowed us to do the work in the juvenile court. You know, when you think about where your referrals come from, you have to have systems that are on board with what you want to do. School systems have to be on board. The principal of a school has to be on board if his folks are going to be able to send you a referral. If we're going to get a referral out of the court system, the DA and the underlings of the DA have got to be on board. The public defender's office has got to be on board. So it makes a great deal of difference whether you've got the folks that run the system being supportive of what you're trying to do or not. Without them, there are no referrals.
Lori, I don't know what EDI means, but maybe John will. How can this process be used as a tool for EDI?
I don't know what EDI is.
It's equity, diversity, and inclusion.
All right, talk to me a little bit more about that, Laurie.
And just in terms, you were talking about that pastor who realized that people in his church were not on the same page,
Right.
And that you use these circles and you use that tool in order to help. I'm not sure what you help them do, but I'm just looking at in other industries, not faith-based, how do you use these circles? How do you use those tools in order when you have a really toxic, racially toxic environment to help the members become ready to advance beyond the point of where they are?
Okay, great question, Lori. And I will say it is not easy, but I believe you have to start with relationship. I don't think you can start with the fight. One thing that I say is my circle mentor is Kay Pranis. And if you ever want to learn more about circle, I would just encourage you to Google Kay Pranis and read some of her material. I give her credit for teaching me this, that before you get to the problem in the room, you've got to understand the people in the room. And one thing that we have spent time on wherever we go is building relationship and helping people get to know each other. This school that I'll be in tomorrow has had some racially charged conflict from last year before COVID shut everything down. And I'm not going to directly talk about that with them tomorrow because I don't have time. What I want to do tomorrow is give them an opportunity to tell stories, to get to know each other, to understand what their shared values are. I've got a prompt where I'm going to ask them to describe the culture that they grew up in and what were some important parts of that culture and who taught them about that culture. So I think it's critically important, and one of the teachings of restorative justice is to build relationship before you try to start addressing problems. Circle is not necessarily the go-to restorative tool to address conflict. I believe that when you've got folks that are in conflict, the facilitated dialogue model is probably a better conflict resolution tool where you can, if you've got 2 people that have had conflict, work with those 2 people and help them to understand each other better and try to find some reconciliation around that. And I think you can get to a point that you can bring folks together in circle and address those things. And Laurie, I'm long-winded and I give long answers to just about everything. The bottom line is, I believe you start with in building relationship. I mean, let me give you a quick example. And you don't start in the deep end of building relationship. You start in the shallow end. So one of my getting acquainted prompts tomorrow is going to be, tell us about your philosophy around using your car horn. Now that's going to be fun. I mean, I've done that a lot. And even for people that are mad at each other, it's difficult not to smile and laugh a little bit when you start talking about your philosophy around using your car horn. Once we can do that, then we can get into some of the deeper questions. And Laurie, this is one reason that it's so important for us, people that think they might want to be interested in learning how to do this work, is to do the awareness piece first. I can talk about this all day long. There is nothing like you experiencing this though. And so I would just encourage anybody that wants to know more to try to have that 3-hour awareness experience so you can truly experience the circle process. It is extremely powerful. You're muted, Becky.
We do have a question. Any suggestions on how circles are possible virtually?
Well, it's just about all I've done since March. Zoom is a pretty powerful tool. I mean, I would much rather be with you in the room tonight, but if I can't be with you, this is a pretty good alternative to me. So what we do in Zoom circles is we introduce a talking piece, just like I would in the room. We establish an order, and you usually can click on your participant list and it will, it orders things in alphabetical order for you. That is the order of the talking piece will go. And so we would create values about what are the values that you need the rest of us to bring into the circle tonight to make this a safe place for you to tell your stories and become vulnerable. And that's the way that the talking piece would be passed around in that established order. I had to finish my class last semester that way because we couldn't meet in person. And I was at a point in the semester where we were telling our stories, and I was brokenhearted that we weren't going to be able to do that. And I just didn't think it was possible to do it in as meaningful a way virtually as when you're together. But I was pleasantly surprised, and I've been pleasantly surprised at how well circles have gone this summer, as we've done a lot of training and a lot of circles, check-in circles and healing circles and that sort of thing with folks in the Wake County school system and in other places. So it can be very effective. Becky, I just noticed when a chat came up on the screen a while ago, somebody was asking about, I think there was a question about whether children of color are referred to us.
Yes.
And most of our referrals in the schools are children of color. Now, that's a double-edged sword. The positive side of that is that they're referred to us and they're not suspended and sent into the court system. The negative side of that is I think children of color are still seen more than white children when it comes to discipline issues. In my mind, based on where I've been as a criminal defense attorney, I think the positive side of that outweighs the negative side. I would much rather those children of color have an opportunity to come into our program than continue to get suspended at the high rates that they have always been suspended. I will tell you though, that even though suspension rates are coming down, the disproportionality of those suspension rates is not changing a whole lot. So there's still work to be done.
Are there other universities like UNC, Duke, someone said Central, UNCG that have programs like this?
I'm not aware of another law school well, I know there's not another law school in North Carolina that has a restorative justice clinic. There are other law schools in the country that have restorative justice clinics. I was on a panel at the ABA conference in San Francisco 2 years ago where there were 5 of us directors talking about our programs. UNCW has a leader in restorative justice. Her name is Dr. Kimberly Cook. She's a criminology professor, undergraduate criminology professor. They don't have a law school, but she's doing an awful lot of restorative justice work in the community down there. Val Hansen is somebody who works in the Dispute Settlement Center in Orange County that is doing a lot of work around Orange County and Chatham County in schools and in the courts, building restorative justice. Durham has a group of volunteers and now a paid staff person. They call themselves RJ Durham, Restorative Justice Durham. They are doing an awful lot of work in the court system, not so much in the schools yet. I think the schools, then they announced a couple of years ago that they were implementing restorative justice in the schools. I don't know much about what's happening in the schools. I know more about what's happening in RJ Durham. So we're seeing it grow. Unfortunately, not so much in law schools, which I think is a perfect place for it to grow. Most law schools have clinics, and most law schools are interested in criminal justice. And I think that restorative justice is the quickest form of justice in our criminal system. As a matter of fact, I try not to refer to it as a criminal justice system because I think it's more accurately referred to as a criminal legal system.
Someone asked, what are the specific rules for being in Circle?
Voluntariness. Everything about restorative justice needs to be seen as being voluntary and being an invitation to come to the table. Like I said a while ago, circles are not the go-to restorative tool for addressing conflict. They are the go-to tool for building relationship and then perhaps being able to get to conflict later on down the road. Circles, you got to think about the size of circles. If we are able to meet in person, I want to hold my number of folks in circle to about 20 because you can imagine when you pass a talking piece, it takes a while for everybody to be able to answer a prompt. And so time is always a consideration. So about 20 is about the top number, and it's imperative that you've got a trained and experienced circle keeper to create an agenda, work with the group, and be with them. Now, circles are not a one and done. Circles are better when they are consistent. Consistency means the same people each time, the same keeper each time, the same place each time, same day, same time, same amount of time. So consistency is important because you're building a trust and relationship within a circle. If circles are itinerant, you have to start over every time. And so, for example, when we go into a prison, we'll go in on, just as an example, Friday morning, every Friday, 9 to 11, the same 10 inmates, the same keepers, the same law students from our clinic, and that kind of consistency for about 15 weeks.
So we've talked about the circles in the schools and in the prisons, but when you're actually dealing with a restorative justice response to a harm that's been done, do you also use the circle, or is that?
Most of the time we start with what I would call facilitated dialogue. That is a facilitator working between a victim and an offender to help them find a place of some sort of understanding and then doing something to try to repair the harm that's done. Often though, especially in more severe crimes, those facilitated dialogues wind up culminating in a circle. It usually is a hybrid form of the circle because there needs to be some truth telling, most of the time offender answering victims' questions. And so you would suspend the talking piece from going around the circle the way that it normally does in that sort of hybrid model. But often you do wind up starting with facilitated dialogue, culminating in a last meeting where other people are invited in, family members, community members, support folks, lawyers maybe, if the adjudication has not happened yet. In the Durham case that I mentioned, the shooting case, the lawyers were with us the whole way. That would make a lot of people nervous, but pre-adjudication, I think that's an appropriate way to go.
I have a question, so this is all kind of very new as a concept in the United States. Is it as new everywhere else? Or are there countries that use this more regularly?
Yeah, certainly there are countries that use this more regularly. It probably is the newest in the United States of just about anywhere in the world. We've always had a very punitive system, and that's one reason that we're slow to incorporate these restorative processes. An example of some places that you can find that this has existed for a long time, New Zealand, for example. They actually have transformed their juvenile legal system from punitive to restorative. They have punitive measures if they need to use them, but the first option is restorative justice.
When I was looking for videos, I found quite a few from Canada and the UK.
Right.
So I didn't know if they were growing it or if it was established.
Well, and it depends. It's like the jurisdiction that I talked about a while ago. It depends on whether it's established or they are growing. So you're going to find some places where it's fairly well established, like in New Zealand, and then other places in Europe and other places that I would say it's growing. And it's growing here. It's growing leaps and bounds in schools, but I don't see it growing that way in our criminal legal system. And my hope is I don't see it that way yet.
So how would the community pressure the system to change in that direction?
Do you know the DA?
I do not.
Well, I think community can bring change. I mean, I think folks just like you that are sitting on this Zoom call because you're interested in all these kinds of topics can bring change. I think if you're interested in experiencing yourself, that's a great first step. I think reading material that you can find is a good thing to do. You probably have folks in your church that work in our criminal legal system in Wake County and in North Carolina. Talk to them and bring them to the table. You know, let's have some conversations. I do believe in grassroots efforts. I believe in changing from the bottom up instead of necessarily from the top down. I think it can happen both ways. But I kind of jokingly say I had an office in the law school for 3 years before people really figured out why I was there. And I was doing this work, and it was low profile, and it was growing and building. And now I have a hard time putting everything on my calendar, you know, because of the requests that come in.
Okay, go ahead.
I've been in several conversations related to the topic of defund the police with people on both sides. And it seems to me that in these conversations, the two sides kind of end up in the same place, more or less, which is, this is not really so much about defunding the police, it's kind of changing the way we do policing and criminal justice. And I'm wondering if that's kind of a movement in the direction of restorative justice. How do you look at that?
Yeah, I do. I do see it that way. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I was having a conversation with somebody about this last night. I think the term defund is I think it's largely misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's the best term for what people really mean. Now, some people mean get rid of the police. Some people mean that. But some people mean divert funds to more socially responsible kinds of things than just locking everybody up and coming out in riot gear. And personally, that's where I'm at. I tell you one thing that I do is I offer ride-alongs with the Raleigh Police Department for my law students in my clinic. And the reason is because I want them to be more informed than just by what they see on the news. And as a criminal defense attorney, I got to tell you, my respect for most law enforcement, not all, because some of them I just couldn't wait to tear them apart in cross-examination. But for most of them, my respect grew because of the job that they do and the way that they do it. And I want my students to see that. And I'll try to make this quick and give you an example. on the ride along that I did before I offered it to my students, the first call we were on was a man who was at a convenience store and wouldn't leave, and they said he was trespassing. Well, when we got there, he was pretty drunk and he was causing some problems, and the police officer had a conversation with him, and he knew him because he worked in that community all the time. And he asked him if he had had anything to drink. He said no. He asked him if he'd had anything to eat. He said no. And he told him, he said, I don't want to arrest you, but I need you to leave the premises and go home. If you come back, I'm going to arrest you, but I don't want to do that now. He said, okay. And he began to stumble away. And he said, hang on. And the cop opened his trunk. And I'm like, oh my God, what is he fixing to do? Well, what he did was he pulled out a bottle of water and a Slim Jim and a pack of nabs, and he gave it to the guy. Got back in the car. I said, now, was that RPD policy or was that you policy? He said, the guy's hungry. Well, I want people to see that, and I want my students to see that. And I don't want law enforcement to have to do every job in the world when they're out there on the streets. And it's a dangerous place to be. I'm not discounting the bad stuff that happened. There's a lot of bad stuff that happens. I'm not saying that it doesn't. It does. But I am for moving money into more socially conscious areas than just in law enforcement and riot gear and tanks and SWAT teams and that sort of thing.
One of the things that I've been looking at just in terms of culture and norms, have you seen any difference regarding how circles work or how restorative justice is perceived within different cultures and even within different races?
I guess I would start by saying I have seen that a lot of the movement has been led in the United States by white folks. I have experienced that it is received when people come to the table very well, no matter culture, race differences. I think we need to develop more leadership, maybe especially within the Black community. And one way that we're doing that, Lori, in the school system is we are, even while we wait for the school system to fund positions, we are inviting apprentices to come in and be trained and begin to keep circle. So hopefully they are ready when the school system is able to begin to fund these positions. They funded 4 positions the first 2 years, and hopefully I'd love to see them double that each year or 2. And so I do think we need more people of color within the leadership of that. But the way that folks receive it when they come to the circle, I think has been pretty uniformly positive. The mission is twofold. We offer direct services of restorative practices, but we also have a mission to help people understand about this and to help them to do it on their own. So we do both. We offer direct services and we offer education and training.